Hello, everyone. Welcome to You Do You speaker series, How to Find Your Wow. And I have a very special guest today, Suzanne Anderson. And I'm Melinda Broadstone, your host. And I'm so excited, delighted, I can't even say enough to have her here today. She's going to be talking about the topic of abandonment. And there's so many directions we can go with that. I'm sure it's going to be very insightful and helpful for people. And Susan, I just want to say hello, welcome, thank you.
I'm happy to be here.
So, the way I met Susan was that I actually went through a big traumatic event, and I was like totally like incapacitated. And so I went to the bookstore thinking, okay, I've got to figure out something. I've got to find a solution with a brain that wasn't working. And I reach in, I grab a book. I have no idea who the author is or what the book's about. And I open it up, and there the word was shattered. And that was exactly what I was feeling. And I knew in that moment that this woman knew what she was talking about in terms of my pain. And that's what's so important about these topics is that when you hear somebody speak to your pain, you know that there's a connection there with solving your problem. And so I want to tell you a little bit more officially about Susan and her history. She's been in the field for a very long time, 30 years. She's devoted that time in clinical experience and research. She's done quite a bit of research working with victims of abandonment trauma. She's founder of the Abandonment Recovery and Outer Child Movement. She is author of Journey from Abandonment to Healing, Taming Your Outer Child, Overcoming Your Self-Defeating Patterns, Black Swan, one of my favorites, The 12 Lessons of Abandonment and Recovery, and the Abandonment Recovery Workshop. And so that is actually how I was deeply introduced to Susan's work, was through the Abandonment Workshop over at Esalen quite a few years ago now. Is there something you would like to, I'd like to have the audience hear how you kind of entered into this and became such an expert.
Well, similar to you, I went through my own adult profound abandonment experience, and I was already a therapist, and I already looked at things through the lens of abandonment, but this opened up an amazing awareness that got me on a research bend and a book writing bend, because I realized that what awakened in me wasn't just the trigger of a breakup, which was profound and painful as could possibly be, but it was the primal abandonment wound, the underlying thing that is the crux of the human condition, that fear that we have in the deep part of our hearts that we're afraid to even touch. It opened that up. And so the reason that the experience of going through a breakup in my adult life, and it could be triggered by so many things, losing your job, losing your sense of purpose. I mean, going through a breakup is one enormous trigger, but that it actually brings up all those primal feelings, the primal abandonment fear and the hidden shame. You know, shame is a huge component of abandonment, but it's hidden. We barely even know that we're feeling it because we're so ashamed of being ashamed, but it sort of brings all of that up. And so the experience is demoralizing. It hurts our self-esteem. It makes us feel worthless. And the rejection, just the hidden shame that it arouses is just absolutely excruciating. And so the experience of going through an adult trigger can often be shattering. That's the beginning of the 5 phases of abandonment. So when I help people deal with an adult experience that they're going through, whether it's, a breakup or losing a job or one of their children has stopped speaking to them or something like that, we always need to get to the core, to the root, to the taproot of where the pain is coming from, and that is the underlying primal wound of abandonment. It's the source of all dysfunction and distress in anyone's life. It's the source of depression and anxiety and insecurity and self-defeating behaviors. It's the source of everything that stems from emotional issues, because it is the original emotion that we all carry within us.
And is it the same for all of us? I mean, and how do you get that? How do you get down to that bottom floor?
Well, you know, some people had very traumatic childhoods, and they may be more easily triggered than someone else. But there are people who had wonderful, happy childhoods with two parents who loved them and doting aunts and uncles and grandparents, and they never felt any conscious feelings of abandonment or shame. But of course, you can't be on the planet without fearing that you'll lose what you have.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we all know loss is possible at a certain age. But even people who had really ideal childhoods can have a very big, like an overreaction. It isn't an overreaction, it's very normal when they go through an adult trigger. And it's because even though they didn't have a traumatic history, all of those feelings are still there. So they're universal. We all have them, but some people have more, you know, there's been more wounding. The wound is a little bigger and more easy to bump into by life.
Yes. So, and that's part of what interests me, is that you don't have to even be aware. You know, for many years I wasn't aware, but as I work with clients, especially entrepreneurs, oftentimes they're not self-identifying as having any kind of big trauma in their life, but yet they have this undercurrent of stuff that's going on that keeps them from stepping fully into who they can be and advancing their business and really finding a healthy relationship, being in a healthy relationship, and knowing how to keep it going and like that. And so it's like that word abandonment can seem so foreign to somebody who doesn't have that big trauma on their radar. How do
But
they
once you open
self-identify?
yourself up to the fact that we all have a primal abandonment wound, and it's abandonment, fear, and shame that are sort of in there deeply. Once we tune into that, I mean, profound personal growth is possible, because then whatever we do to help ourselves, we heal from the inside out, because it brings us all the way to the inside. But you mentioned awareness, and it's really, there is a lack of awareness that not just people who haven't, you know, heard much about abandonment, but I mean all of us, including me, because there's a lack of awareness because we go ahead and live our lives. We're not thinking about where the source of where this is coming from. We're feeling it, but it's subliminal. So, you know, let's say the abandonment fear and the shame are there. We're not thinking of those things when we're kind of in our life, maybe not performing at our top, when we're having performance anxiety and it's interfering, or when we're not following through. We're not thinking that it's because we're afraid of taking the risk, because what if we get rejected or abandoned, or we don't feel really good about ourselves because the hidden shame is kind of eroding our self-esteem. We're not thinking of the primal stuff going on. We're in our lives, you know, functioning and doing things, but that's what's going on. And the minute you start to look in and acknowledge those things, and of course through exercises, it isn't a wallowing process. You know, it's an actual, you know, systematic program that you do. But once you start going in, all of a sudden, everything that you're struggling with and your life itself starts to make sense.
Hmm. So would you recommend for somebody who doesn't identify a real big abandonment trauma in their life to explore doing this kind of work anyways, as a foundational healing for just being more functional, more happy, more everything?
Well, anyone who's interested in self-improvement, anyone who's reaching for some kind of higher self or a better life or to be happier, really does need to, get in touch with what's going on in the core. It'll help them a tremendous amount. It'll give tremendous power and force to all of their other efforts. So I would recommend that getting in touch with that underlying, universal primal stuff is very helpful to any growth process.
Yes, and it's interesting because having your own business, which is I switched over from being employed to having my own business, and just having your own business and being responsible for every step of the way and all of the things that you have to do to put yourself out there triggers an incredible amount of fear. So it taps into that primal stuff. And I think that's why the success rate of the entrepreneur group as a whole is rather quite low, because I think that's at the root. I'm guessing that's probably what's holding them back.
Yeah, I mean, that's when you get into the outer child part, because, you have these primal feelings that are hidden. They're unconscious, more or less unconscious. We're not in touch with them. We're not aware of them, but they're interfering in our performance. So the outer child is doing things like, let's say the inner child is feeling shame and fear. But the outer child is saying, oh, then we'll just procrastinate. Oh, then we won't bother. We'll just avoid doing that. Or, well, we'll just do it louder. Or we'll compete. We'll go against somebody else. Or a million ways that kind of sabotage and bog down the process of simply succeeding. The outer child is famous for interfering in the workplace, because the workplace is where we're so triggered. All of our vulnerabilities and our insecurities are triggered. Putting yourself out there, having people react to you or to your stuff is a very vulnerable place. So you can imagine all the, the abandonment feelings and shame and fear, all that are inside, and the outer child acting it out by avoiding and procrastinating and screwing up in a million different ways.
Yes, and it's interesting that so much of that can be internalized to I don't know if that's the right word, but I hear people all the time saying, well, that's just who I am. And so these behaviors that can be a little bit troublesome socially and in relationships, like, if you're procrastinating all the time and the engine blows up because you didn't get the oil changed, there's just different ways that it manifests, right? And these types of things, or the pushing back, or the way that, or jealousy, or a lot of those things, it's like they just seem like they're part of who people feel like, well, that's just part of who I am and I can't change that. And what it sounds like to me is that if we took a look, if we turned our attention in towards ourselves and actually questioned that and went, well, really, do I have to be like this? Couldn't it be more fun, more relaxing, more comfortable, and get more things done than what am I looking at here, and what can I do about it?
Well, but people make that statement, it's just the way I am, because partially they're trying to have self-acceptance. They're trying not to be critical of every little thing that they don't do. But the other part of that is that they don't have the tools to fix it, because the patterns of self-sabotage that arise from unresolved abandonment, from having all of that unconscious, hidden, all of those feelings that we don't deal with, but the patterns that come out of that, the patterns of self-sabotage, are very hard to break. Outer child hates change and doesn't want to change. And outer child just wants to keep right on doing what he's doing, or she wants to keep right on procrastinating, or right on, not exercising and lazing around, whatever it is,
Yep.
outer child does not want to change. So at some point, without tools, people will say, this is just the way I am, because they don't know how to change it. And believe me, even with tools, it's a lot of work. You need a lot of motivation. But they don't have the tools to do it. So then they think, well, let me accept myself as I am. And so they're kind of letting their hopes and dreams die, because they're trying to let me adjust my hopes and dreams to make them smaller, because this is just the way I am. It's a very human dilemma.
Yeah, it's being between a rock and a hard place.
Yes, it is.
Well, I do want people to know about the gift that you're giving, because Susan's being very generous in offering a discount on one of her workshops. And I have been to a week-long program, abandonment healing program at Esalen with Susan. And she creates such a container of safety. And, the thing that you talked about with shame, I can remember I put plastic on my face, right? I put a plastic smile, and I was like a zombie walking into work, trying to not let anybody know. I didn't want to talk about it. It felt so shameful. And I didn't want to risk somebody not understanding and making me feel worse, and so forth. And going to that workshop, first of all, you get some perspective, because I think everybody in the room experienced, I thought my story was bad, but hearing everybody else's story, it was shocking to see and know the things that people experience and deal with. And I'll tell you, it gives me more compassion for everybody, because we never know what somebody's walking around with and the pain they're suffering through. And so I want everybody to know that when you hear about this offer, you really should consider it, because Susan is wonderful at creating a container of safety, so that a little bit of the story can come out, so that we can solve the problem, but not get stuck in the story. And I think that's such that was the only, if that wouldn't have happened from the outset, I probably would have walked out after the first day, whether it was you or anybody. Because that's like the first requirement, right? To be able to do this work is to be able to feel safe, and like somebody's commanding the situation, so that you don't inadvertently end up traumatized yet again.
Well, the idea of the sharing that takes place in the abandonment recovery workshop is a shame reduction vehicle, because we share in a large group, if you recall, and also in the small group. So those are two different types of sharing. The large group represents the world outside, and the smaller group represents, intimacy. And we share in both of those groups. And as a result of sharing, we have less shame. And people at the end of the workshop, maybe 3 months down the road, will report that they're having, they're doing stuff. They're pursuing goals they never pursued before. They're feeling a little better. Well, where does this bump up come from? It comes from the fact that they have less shame. They have reduced unconsciously. They didn't even know they were doing it, but the sharing and the joining of the community and the realization that what they're going through is universal has a profound effect. But then also it has to do with practicing the tools. You don't think your way out of abandonment. You don't obsess your way out, although it creates obsession to go through like a heartbreak or something, or complete obsession. But it's the brain trying to fix the problem the wrong way. But the way we get out of it is by doing. It's doing that gets us out. You do your way out of abandonment. And the workshops get you to do the tools right there in the workshop, and then share what it feels like. Because if you leave it up to people just to read the book they might read the book, but not do the exercises.
Exactly.
So the workshop really creates quite a bump up. Just doing the exercises with a group and sharing it lifts the self-esteem because it reduces the shame and also gives people the benefit of those exercises. Of course, the idea is to get people to do the exercises for a few months after the workshop, ongoing.
Yes. Well, there, and some things that can be carried forward, they're just really relevant no matter what part of life you're in, can be carried forward and really useful. But one of the things that you had mentioned and that was really key, because that shame piece is about like you feel this certain way and it feels so toxic and yet you feel helpless to change it. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the biology of that, because when I began to understand that that was a component and that that it wasn't like I was self-imposing this, it took me off the hook a little bit and I was able to progress more knowing.
Everybody has shame. Everybody has feelings of being unworthy, not enough, powerless, puny, unable to command attention. But it comes from the birth trauma. It comes from very early childhood. You're born, everything's beautiful. Then you're thrown out into this cold world. Then you're picked up. Oh, it feels so good. Then you're put on a cold bassinet. Then you're gathered up again and picked up. Oh, it feels good. Then you're back on something cold and flat. So we go through separation and disconnection. Connection feels good, disconnection. So we're conditioned to love connection and not disconnection so much. So this conditions us to always seek connection. But when we're like little toddlers and we start screaming and crying and it doesn't bring mommy by the crib, mommy doesn't come. And then she does come and we start cooing and blowing bubbles, blah, 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 and mommy doesn't smile or mommy's distracted. Then you start to accumulate feelings of not being enough, of feeling powerless. They're wordless feelings. You don't have a language yet. You're too young. But of course, you also have experiences where you cry and mommy comes running, or you go blah, 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 blow bubbles and, oh, look how cute. You have both. You accumulate feelings of shame, of not being enough, and then, or being powerless, impotence. And then you accumulate feelings of being powerful and special. And as you develop, you have millions of experiences. Kids don't want to play with you, or they do, so life is just, you accumulate various positive and negative feelings in very early childhood. So that's the biology. If you follow the biology of conditioning in the brain, then you will see exactly how it isn't just a feeling or a thought. It is in the brain. Conditioning is deep structure. It's hard wiring. It starts out with a sort of a tabula rasa, supposedly. Well, something close to it. And then it gets developed early on and it continues to develop.
And then how does that tie into the physiology of the process of like when there's a trigger and you go full on into it?
Well, the amygdala is the part of the brain that responds to aversive stimuli, fear. It's sort of an oversimplification, emotion. And so it has a way of recording. It's where the conditioning really takes place, especially fear conditioning. So when you have an adult trigger, it triggers things that are reminiscent of the very early conditioning. It triggers the emotion, the amygdala, and you can have a full-blown fight or flight response or freeze. You can be on a date and become wooden, or that's freeze. You could become angry and not, out of the clear blue sky, or you can leave. You can, you can't handle it. Fight, flee, or freeze, the emergency states. It can be triggered. And you think, why am I reacting like such a basket case? It's because the trigger triggered the amygdala, which had been conditioned.
Mm-hmm. And so does somehow the biology and the physiology tie back into it? Seems like, well, from what you're saying is that pretty much everybody has this primal abandonment thing, but for the people who really kind of live it on a more regular basis and have had to work through some pretty significant trauma. I'm also wondering about self-abandonment. Like, is self-abandonment?
Well, self-abandonment is how it happens in adulthood. We're too old to be abandoned now. When we were little and we feared abandonment, we were fearing for our lives because we were too little to survive on our own. But we're adults. We can survive on our own, but we can fear abandonment. We can feel shame, and we can fear that we'll be abandoned emotionally. But it's all emotional abandonment. But it creates self-abandonment. Self-abandonment is when we sabotage ourselves, when we give up our goals, when, there are so many ways. Self-abandonment is self-doubt. There are so many ways that we move away from the self-love, capacity of human beings.
And so what would you say is like the primary feature in that keeps people from being successful in a relationship if they don't address it?
If the any of the unresolved abandonment gets played out, especially in an intimate relationship or with close friends, because the other person becomes the object. So any of your stuff that isn't resolved is going to get enacted in that relationship. You'll feel insecure. You'll need reassurance. You'll become a bully, and they become a victim. All these things get enacted because of all the unresolved stuff. And of course, there's no perfect recovery. And if anything, I'd like to leave everyone with this idea that when you do work on this material, and it is doable, you can make a tremendous improvement in your life, but you don't make these improvements perfectly. They're imperfect. You do the best you can, and it makes an improvement that makes your life completely better. So when people think, well, I have to resolve all of my unresolved abandonment. No, but you resolve enough of it, and you resolve what you can as you get in touch with it, and it begins to show up in your life.
I love that because the perfectionists could go crazy with this, right? And drive themselves into the ground.
Yes.
And the rest of us could just say, why bother?
Right.
And so if there's a middle ground of, you can make big impact and really make changes in your life, and the journey is probably never done. And that's probably true for every aspect of our life, right? We're always in process. That's growth. That's change. That's life. So I love that as a way to end. Please remind us, what's the name of the workshop that you're giving 5% off
It's
on?
abandonment recovery workshops. And right now they're online, and they work online. We have these incredible groups. I don't have a date for the next workshop, but it'll be within a month or so.
Okay.
And people can keep track of my website, abandonment.net, and find out when the next one is. And I also do workshops at venues, but after the pandemic, those have to be started up again at the different venues, Esalen and different places around the world.
Yeah. And actually, now that you mentioned the pandemic, so many things. I know I've been triggered by the pandemic in terms of, first, I didn't want to be isolated, then I didn't want to go out.
And yes, so we've all become turtles. We're turtles.
Yeah. So the work that you're doing, I'm sure, is going to help a lot of people that are also trying to deal with these transitions of social, not social, and all of the in-between stuff. I so much want to thank you for coming on and being
It
with
was
us
my
today.
pleasure, Melinda. Thank you for having me.
You bet. I want to just remind the audience that you will have the link for that 5% off in the show notes and in the emails. We'll make sure you have it. And you know where to find Susan. Please look her up. And thank you so much. It was wonderful
Thank you.
talking to you.
Good talking to you too, Melinda.